In the dusty frontier town of Tucson, Arizona, 1886, a single click of a camera shutter would ignite a chain of events that would echo through the desert canyons for generations. What started as an ambitious photographer's quest to document the vanishing Apache people became a deadly game of cat and mouse across the unforgiving Sonoran Desert. Edward Morrison thought he was capturing history. Instead, he captured something far more dangerous: the soul of Ayanna, a towering Apache warrior woman whose tribe believed that photographs could steal the very essence of a person's being. When that glass plate negative was developed in Morrison's makeshift darkroom, it didn't just reveal an image. It revealed a declaration of war. The Apache had a saying, "Take what belongs to the earth, and the earth will take from you." Morrison was about to learn that some things are too sacred to steal, and some people are too proud to let theft go unpunished. What followed was a pursuit that would test the limits of survival, honor, and the price of a single moment frozen in time. This is the true story of how one photograph nearly cost a man his life, and how an Apache woman's quest for justice became legend in the American Southwest. Edward Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he adjusted the heavy wooden tripod for what felt like the 100th time that scorching afternoon. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on his canvas hat, and the metal components of his large-format camera were almost too hot to touch. But Morrison was a man possessed by purpose, driven by an ambition that had brought him over 2,000 miles from his comfortable photography studio in Boston to this hostile frontier. At 32 years old, Morrison had already established himself as one of the East Coast's most sought-after portrait photographers. Wealthy families paid handsomely to have their likenesses captured by skilled hands, and his studio on Beacon Hill was booked months in advance. But Morrison yearned for something more than endless portraits of stern-faced industrialists and their elaborately dressed wives. He wanted to create something that would outlast him, something that would be remembered long after the last of his society portraits had faded. The idea had come to him during a lecture at Harvard University, where Professor Henry Whitman had spoken passionately about the vanishing races of the American West. Whitman had shown lantern slides of Native American tribes, explaining how their traditional ways of life were disappearing as white settlement expanded westward. These people and their cultures will be gone within a generation, Whitman had declared, his voice heavy with both sadness and urgency. Someone must preserve them before it's too late. That night, Morrison had made his decision. He would travel west and create the definitive photographic record of the Native American tribes before their way of life disappeared forever. It would be his masterpiece, his contribution to history. He imagined the acclaim he would receive, the exhibitions in New York and Washington, the book deals that would surely follow. His name would be spoken in the same breath as Matthew Brady and William Henry Jackson. Morrison had spent months preparing for the expedition. He studied maps, corresponded with frontier guides, and invested nearly his entire savings in the finest photographic equipment available. His wagon now carried 3 cameras of different sizes, dozens of glass plate negatives, chemicals for developing, and a portable darkroom tent that he had specially commissioned. Everything had to be perfect for this journey that would make his reputation. The first few months of his travels had gone better than expected. Morrison had successfully photographed members of the Navajo, Pueblo, and Hopi tribes, carefully documenting their clothing, tools, and daily activities. While some tribal members had been hesitant about being photographed, most had been curious about the strange white man with his mysterious black box. A few trinkets and small payments had usually been enough to gain cooperation. But the Apache were different. Morrison had heard the stories, of course. Even in Boston, people spoke in hushed tones about the fierce Apache warriors who had terrorized the Southwest for decades. Geronimo had only surrendered the previous year, and tensions between the Apache and white settlers remained dangerously high. Most people advised Morrison to avoid Apache territory altogether. However, Morrison's guide, a grizzled former cavalry scout named Tom Bradley, had convinced him otherwise. The Apache might be the fiercest fighters in the territory, Bradley had said, stroking his salt and pepper beard, but they're also the most magnificent. If you really want to capture the spirit of the West, you can't ignore them. Bradley claimed to know a small Apache band that had recently settled near a seasonal water source about 50 miles southeast of Tucson. They're peaceful enough, he assured Morrison. Mostly women, children, and old men. Most of the warriors went north with Geronimo or got themselves killed fighting the cavalry. But they still lived the old way, follow the old customs. Perfect for what you're looking for. The journey to find the Apache camp had taken 3 days through increasingly rugged terrain. Morrison's wagon, loaded down with equipment, struggled over rocky paths that barely deserved to be called trails. Several times, he and Bradley had to unload everything and carry the gear by hand while coaxing the horses through narrow mountain passes. On the 3rd day, as they crested a small ridge overlooking a hidden canyon, Bradley suddenly raised his hand for silence. Below them, Morrison could see a cluster of traditional Apache wickiups scattered around a small spring. Smoke rose from several cooking fires, and he could make out figures moving between the dwellings. After days of seeing nothing but empty desert, the sight of the peaceful camp was almost magical. "There they are," Bradley whispered. "Just like I promised. Maybe 20, 30 people at most." Morrison felt his heart rate increase with excitement. This was exactly what he had been looking for, an authentic Apache settlement, untouched by white influence. He could already envision the powerful photographs he would create, the way the dramatic canyon walls would frame his subjects, the play of light and shadow across weathered faces that had witnessed the passing of an entire way of life. "How do we approach them?" Morrison asked, checking his camera equipment one final time. Bradley considered the question carefully. "Apache are proud people, maybe the proudest in all the territory. Can't just ride down there like we own the place. Got to show respect, let them know we come in peace." They spent the better part of an hour working their way down into the canyon, making enough noise to announce their presence without appearing threatening. As they drew closer to the camp, Morrison could see that their arrival had not gone unnoticed. Apache faces watched them from the shadows of the wickiups, and he felt the weight of dozens of eyes tracking their every movement. An elderly Apache man emerged from the largest wickiup and walked slowly toward them. His weathered face was impossible to read, but he carried no weapons, and his posture suggested curiosity rather than hostility. Bradley dismounted and raised his hands to show they were empty. "I am Tom Bradley," he said in broken Apache, supplemented with hand gestures. "This man is Picturemaker. We come with respect." The elderly Apache studied them both for a long moment before responding in accented English. "I'm Joseph Crow Feather. Why does Picturemaker come to our camp?" Morrison climbed down from the wagon, his legs stiff from the long journey. Up close, he could see that Crow Feather was probably in his 70s, his long gray hair decorated with beads and feathers. Despite his age, the old man carried himself with unmistakable dignity. "I am Edward Morrison," he said, trying to project confidence and respect. "I travel from the east to make pictures of the Apache people, to show others your way of life, your customs." Crow Feather's eyes narrowed slightly. "Many white men come to look at Apache. Most bring trouble. I bring no trouble," Morrison insisted. "Only this." He gestured toward his camera equipment. "I wish to capture the beauty and strength of your people." For several minutes, Crow Feather said nothing. Morrison could feel sweat beading on his forehead, and not just from the desert heat. Everything depended on this moment. If the Apache refused to cooperate, his entire expedition could be ruined. Finally, Crow Feather nodded slowly. "You may make camp by the spring. Tomorrow, we will talk more of these pictures." That evening, as Morrison set up his equipment and prepared his chemicals, he felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The Apache had been polite but distant, watching his every movement with expressions he couldn't read. Children peered at him from behind their mother's skirts, while the adults maintained a careful reserve. Bradley had managed to trade for some food, and they shared a simple meal of corn mush and dried meat with their hosts. Crow Feather spoke at length in Apache with the other tribal members, occasionally glancing in Morrison's direction. Morrison wished he could understand what was being discussed, but Bradley's Apache was limited to basic trading phrases. As the sun set behind the canyon walls, casting everything in shades of red and gold, Morrison began to set up his camera for the first photograph. The light was perfect, and he had spotted several excellent compositions throughout the camp. But as he began to extend the camera's bellows, he noticed that the Apache had grown quiet and were watching him with what seemed like increased tension. "Something wrong?" he asked Bradley quietly. Bradley scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Hard to say. Apache got their own beliefs about things. Maybe they're just curious about how that contraption of yours works." Morrison decided to proceed slowly and carefully. He set up his camera at a respectful distance from the main camp and focused on the landscape first, taking a few photographs of the canyon walls and the spring. Several Apache approached to watch, fascinated by the large camera and Morrison's methodical process. When he emerged from his darkroom, tent an hour later with the developed plates, showing clear, sharp images of their canyon home, the Apache reaction was immediate and intense. Some drew back in apparent fear, while others pressed forward to examine the glass negatives more closely. Animated discussions broke out in Apache, with voices rising in what sounded like argument. Crowfeather held up one of the plates to catch the firelight, staring at the image for a long time. When he looked back at Morrison, his expression was unreadable. "The picture maker captures more than image," he said finally. "Apache believe all things have spirit. Picture maker takes spirit, puts in glass." Morrison felt his stomach tighten. He had encountered similar beliefs among other tribes, but usually he had been able to work around them with patience and small gifts. "I mean no harm to anyone's spirit," he said carefully. "The pictures will honor your people." Crowfeather translated Morrison's words, sparking another intense discussion among the tribal members. Finally, he turned back to the photographer. "Some say picture maker is which who steals spirits. Others say spirits in pictures might speak to future generations of Apache, keep our ways alive when we are gone." He paused, studying Morrison's face. "Tomorrow, you may make pictures of some who are willing. But you must understand, not all Apache will agree." That night, Morrison lay awake in his bedroll, staring up at the star-filled sky and listening to the night sounds of the desert. He was so close to achieving his goal, but he sensed undercurrents of tension that made him uneasy. Bradley snored peacefully beside him, apparently unconcerned, but Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking on dangerous ground. The next morning dawned clear and hot. Morrison was up early, checking his equipment and preparing fresh chemical solutions. He had decided to start with landscape photographs and gradually work up to portraits, hoping to build trust gradually. Several of the younger Apache men seemed interested in the camera, and Morrison was optimistic about gaining their cooperation. It was mid-morning when she appeared. Morrison was adjusting his camera position to capture the play of sunlight on the canyon walls when he became aware that someone was watching him. He looked up to see an Apache woman standing about 30 feet away, studying him with an intensity that made his breath catch. She was unlike any woman he had ever seen. Tall and powerfully built, she stood at least 6 feet in height, with broad shoulders and arms that showed the definition of someone accustomed to physical labor. Her long black hair was decorated with intricate beadwork, and she wore traditional Apache clothing that seemed to emphasize rather than hide her impressive physical presence. But it was her face that truly captured Morrison's attention. Strong-featured and aristocratic, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge and experience far beyond her apparent age, which Morrison guessed to be somewhere in her 30s. There was something regal about her bearing, as if she were accustomed to command and respect. "Who is that?" Morrison asked Bradley quietly. Bradley followed his gaze and immediately stiffened. "That's Ayanna, Crowfeather's daughter. She was married to one of Geronimo's war chiefs before he was killed by cavalry 3 years ago." Morrison continued to stare, mesmerized. In all his travels, he had never encountered a woman who projected such natural authority and dignity. She would make an incredible photographic subject, the embodiment of Apache strength and pride that he had come west to document. "Has she said anything about being photographed?" Morrison asked. Bradley shook his head. "Ayanna don't say much about anything to white men. Word is she blames us for everything that's happened to her people. Lost her husband, 2 brothers, and her infant son in the wars. She's got good reason to hate us." As if he had heard them talking about her, Ayanna began walking toward them. Morrison felt his pulse quicken as she approached. Up close, she was even more impressive, tall enough to look him directly in the eye, with a presence that seemed to fill the space around her. She spoke briefly in Apache, her voice low and musical, but with an edge that suggested she was not making a request. "What did she say?" Morrison asked. Bradley looked uncomfortable. "She wants to know why you point your spirit-stealing box at her people's home." Morrison took a deep breath. This was his chance to make a connection, to gain the cooperation of what was clearly an influential member of the tribe. He looked directly at Ayanna, hoping his sincerity would translate across the language barrier. Please tell her that I mean no disrespect. I come from far away to learn about the Apache people, to show others your strength and beauty. I believe the Apache are the most magnificent people in all the West. Bradley translated, speaking more fluently than Morrison had heard him use before. Ayanna listened without expression, her dark eyes never leaving Morrison's face. When Bradley finished, she replied with what sounded like a question. She wants to know what you plan to do with these pictures, Bradley said. Morrison had prepared for this question. I will create a book that will be seen by thousands of people in the East. They will learn to respect and admire the Apache way of life. Your people's story will be preserved forever. Again, Bradley translated. This time, Ayanna's response was longer and more animated, with gestures that suggested she was asking detailed questions. She wants to know if you will show Apache as noble people or as savage enemies, Bradley said. She's seen pictures in white man's newspapers that make Apache look like animals. Morrison felt his opportunity slipping away. Tell her that I see the Apache as they truly are, proud, strong, and beautiful. My pictures will show the truth. Ayanna considered his words for a long moment. Then, to Morrison's surprise, she nodded slowly and said something that made Bradley's eyebrows rise. What did she say? She says she will let you make her picture, but only if you agree to her conditions. Morrison's heart leaped. Getting a portrait of this magnificent woman would be the centerpiece of his entire collection. What are her conditions? Bradley spoke with Ayanna again, and her response was firm and detailed. She says the picture must show her as a warrior, not as decoration for white men to stare at. She will wear her husband's war paint and carry his weapons. And she wants one of the pictures for herself to keep his memory alive. Morrison nodded eagerly. Yes, of course. Whatever she wants. What happened next would haunt Morrison for the rest of his life. Ayanna disappeared into her wiki-up and emerged 20 minutes later, transformed. Gone was the woman in everyday Apache clothing. In her place stood a warrior that seemed to have stepped out of legend itself. She had painted her face with traditional war paint, bold red and black stripes that emphasized the strong lines of her features. Her hair was now braided with feathers and beads that caught the sunlight. She carried a beautifully carved bow nearly as tall as she was, along with a quiver of arrows decorated with intricate beadwork. A bone-handled knife was thrust through her belt, and silver armbands encircled her powerful biceps. But it was the war shirt that completed the transformation. Made of soft buckskin and decorated with hundreds of beads in complex geometric patterns, it was clearly a sacred garment that had belonged to a great warrior. Morrison later learned it had been her deceased husband's most prized possession, worn only in the most important battles and ceremonies. Standing in the morning sunlight at the edge of the canyon, with her hair moving in the desert breeze and her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the camera, Ayanna looked like something out of mythology. Morrison had never seen anything so beautiful or so powerful. With trembling hands, he set up his camera and adjusted the focus. The composition was perfect. Ayanna stood against the dramatic backdrop of red canyon walls, her tall figure dominating the frame. The morning light caught every detail of her war paint and regalia, creating a sense of drama that no studio portrait could ever achieve. Tell her to hold very still, Morrison instructed Bradley. This exposure will take about 30 seconds. Bradley translated, and Ayanna nodded once. Morrison removed the lens cap and began counting silently. For 30 seconds, it seemed to last forever. Ayanna stood motionless as a statue, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Morrison had never seen anyone maintain such perfect stillness, such absolute dignity. When the exposure was complete, Morrison replaced the lens cap with hands that were shaking from excitement. He had just captured what he instinctively knew would be the greatest photograph of his career. The image of this Apache warrior woman would be his masterpiece, the photograph that would make his reputation and preserve the spirit of a vanishing people. What Morrison didn't know was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The change in the Apache camp was immediate and unmistakable. What had been cautious curiosity just moments before transformed into something much darker as word spread that Morrison had photographed Ayanna in her husband's war regalia. Morrison noticed the shift first in the children, who stopped their playing and stared at him with wide, frightened eyes before running to hide behind the adults. Crow Feather emerged from his wiki-up with an expression Morrison had never seen before. The elderly chief's face was a mask of controlled fury, and, when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. The Apache words rolled like thunder across the small camp, causing every person present to stop what they were doing and listen. "What's he saying?" Morrison asked Bradley urgently. The guide's face had gone pale beneath his desert tan. "He's calling a council," Bradley replied, his voice tight with concern. "Says the spirits are angry. Says you've done something that can't be undone." Morrison felt his stomach drop. Everything had seemed to be going so well. Ayanna had posed willingly, even eagerly, for the photograph. She had wanted her picture taken in her husband's war regalia. How could that possibly be wrong? But as Morrison watched the Apache gathering in an ever-tightening circle, he began to understand that he had stumbled into something far more complex than he had imagined. The faces around him were no longer curious or even suspicious. They were frightened and angry. An elderly Apache woman, her gray hair streaked with white and her face lined with decades of desert sun, approached Ayanna and began speaking rapidly in Apache. Her voice was shrill with what sounded like accusation, and she gestured repeatedly toward Morrison and his camera. Ayanna listened in silence, her war-painted face betraying no emotion. "The old woman is Ayanna's aunt," Bradley whispered. "Medicine woman. She's saying you've captured Ayanna's husband's spirit along with hers. Says the war regalia holds his power, and now you've trapped it in your picture box." Morrison's mind raced. He had studied Native American beliefs enough to know that many tribes considered photographs dangerous to the spirit, but he had assumed that Ayanna's willingness to pose meant she didn't share those beliefs. Now he was beginning to realize his mistake. "Can I explain?" Morrison asked. "Tell them I meant no harm." But before Bradley could translate, Ayanna herself stepped forward and began speaking to the assembled tribe. Her voice was clear and strong, cutting through the murmur of frightened conversations. As she spoke, Morrison saw expressions of shock and dismay ripple through the crowd. "She's telling them about the condition she made," Bradley translated quietly, "about wanting the picture to honor her husband's memory. But the medicine woman is saying she's been tricked by white man's magic." The council continued for what felt like hours, though the sun had barely moved in the sky. Apache voices rose and fell in passionate argument, with different tribal members taking turns to speak their piece. Morrison stood apart with Bradley, feeling like a man waiting for a verdict in a trial conducted in a language he couldn't understand. Finally, Crow Feather raised his hand for silence. The camp fell quiet except for the sound of wind through the canyon and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. When the old chief spoke, his voice was heavy with sadness and resignation. "He says the damage is done," Bradley translated. "Says you've captured not just Ayanna's spirit, but the spirit of her dead husband trapped in his war clothes. Says both spirits are now prisoners in your picture box, and the only way to free them is to destroy the picture." Morrison felt panic rising in his chest. The photograph of Ayanna was not just the best picture he had ever taken. It was the centerpiece of his entire expedition, the image that would make his career and justify all the money and time he had invested in this journey. "Tell them I'll make a copy for them," Morrison said desperately. "They can have as many pictures as they want. But please, let me keep the negative." Bradley shook his head before he even finished translating. "Don't think that's going to work. They don't want copies of the spirit trap. They want the original picture destroyed." As if to emphasize the point, several of the Apache men had begun gathering around Morrison's camera equipment, their expressions hostile. Morrison realized with growing alarm that they weren't just asking for the return of the photograph. They were preparing to take it by force. "We need to go," Bradley said quietly. "Now, before this gets out of hand." But before Morrison could respond, Ayanna stepped forward again. She had been silent during most of the council, but now she spoke with an authority that commanded immediate attention. Her words were brief, but powerful, and Morrison could see their impact on the other Apache. "What did she say?" Bradley's face was grim. "She says the damage to the spirits is done, and destroying the picture won't undo it. Says her husband's spirit is trapped in the white man's magic box, and the only way to free him is for the white man to pay the price that Apache law demands." Morrison felt ice form in his veins despite the desert heat. "What price?" "Blood debt," Bradley said simply. Apache believe that when someone steals a person's spirit, they owe a life in return. either their own life or the life of someone they love. The implications hit Morrison like a physical blow. He had come west to create art, to preserve a vanishing culture for posterity. Instead, he had apparently committed what the Apache considered a crime punishable by death. Surely they don't mean that literally, Morrison said, though the expressions on the Apache faces around him suggested otherwise. Dead serious, Bradley confirmed. Apache don't make threats they don't intend to keep. We need to get out of here right now. But, as Morrison began gathering his equipment, Ayanna approached him directly. Up close, with a war paint stark on her face, she looked both beautiful and terrifying. When she spoke, her English was heavily accented, but clear. Picture maker, she said, her voice low and dangerous. You take spirit of my husband. You take part of my spirit. Apache law is clear. Blood pays for blood. Morrison tried to meet her gaze, but the intensity in her dark eyes was overwhelming. I meant no disrespect. I wanted to honor your people, to show the world your strength and beauty. Ayanna's laugh was bitter. White men always speak of honor when they steal from Apache. You steal our land, steal our children for white man schools, steal our sacred places for your towns. Now you steal spirits with magic box. I'll destroy the photograph. Morrison offered desperately. Right now, in front of everyone. Too late, Ayanna replied. Spirit already trapped. Only blood can free husband's spirit to join ancestors. Morrison felt sweat running down his back. The rational part of his mind insisted that this was all superstition, that a photograph couldn't actually trap anyone's spirit. But, standing in this remote canyon, surrounded by Apache warriors whose ancestors had fought the United States Army to a standstill for decades, rationality seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford. How long do I have? Morrison asked. Ayanna considered the question. Apache law gives 3 days for blood debt to be paid. 3 days to return what was stolen or offer life in exchange. And if I don't? Ayanna's smile was cold as winter wind. Then, Apache warriors will come to collect what is owed. Bradley had been loading Morrison's equipment into the wagon with desperate efficiency. We're ready to go, he called out. Horses are hitched, cameras packed. Morrison looked around the Apache camp one last time. The faces watching him were no longer curious or even angry. They were resolved. He had crossed a line he didn't even know existed, and now he would have to live with the consequences. As they climbed up out of the canyon, Morrison could see Ayanna standing at the edge of the camp, still wearing her war paint, still carrying her husband's weapons. She stood motionless as a statue until they disappeared over the ridge, but Morrison could feel her eyes on him like a physical weight. The first day of their flight toward Tucson passed in tense silence. Morrison kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see Apache warriors cresting the horizon behind them. But the desert remained empty except for the occasional lizard or bird of prey. You think they'll actually come after us? Morrison asked Bradley as they made camp that first night. Bradley was checking his rifle for what must have been the 10th time. Apache don't make idle threats. If Ayanna says they're coming for you, then they're coming. Morrison spent a sleepless night staring up at the stars, jumping at every sound. When morning came, he was exhausted and on edge, but there was still no sign of pursuit. Perhaps the Apache had decided to let the matter drop. Perhaps their threats had been meant to frighten him into leaving their territory. By the afternoon of the second day, Morrison had almost convinced himself that the danger had passed. They were making good time toward Tucson, and the desert behind them remained empty. Maybe the Apache had simply wanted to scare him, to teach him a lesson about respecting their beliefs. That illusion was shattered just before sunset. Bradley, who had been scanning their back trail with field glasses, suddenly stiffened. Riders coming, he said tersely. Maybe 5 or 6 of them. Still a long way off, but they're pushing their horses hard. Morrison felt his blood turn to ice. Apache? Got to be. Nobody else would be riding that direction, and they're moving like they know exactly where we're going. Morrison grabbed the field glasses and focused on the distant dust cloud. At the very edge of his vision, he could make out dark figures on horseback, still several miles away, but closing the distance steadily. Even from this distance, there was something relentless about their approach. How far to Tucson? Morrison asked. Bradley did quick mental calculations. 25, maybe 30 miles. If we push the horses, we might make it by tomorrow afternoon. And them, on horseback, traveling light, they'll catch us long before then, if they want to. Morrison felt panic beginning to claw at his chest. What do we do? Bradley was already unhitching the horses from the wagon. We run. Leave the wagon and most of your equipment. Take only what we can carry on horseback. Morrison stared at his wagon full of carefully chosen equipment, the investment of months of planning and most of his savings. I can't leave all this. You can leave it or you can die with it, Bradley said bluntly. Your choice. In the end, the decision was easy. Morrison grabbed his camera and a small case containing his most recent negatives, including the photograph of Ayana, and threw them into a saddlebag. Everything else would have to be abandoned. They rode hard through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and check their back trail. The Apache pursuers never seemed to gain ground, but they never fell behind either. They were there like shadows, persistent and patient, following at a distance that suggested they were content to wait for the right moment. As dawn broke over the desert, Morrison could see the adobe buildings of Tucson in the distance. Civilization at last, safety in numbers, protection under American law. But even as relief flooded through him, Bradley's next words chilled him to the bone. Don't think reaching town is going to end this, the guide said grimly. Apache got long memories, and Ayana's not the type to give up easy. She'll follow you to the ends of the earth if she thinks you owe her husband's spirit a blood debt. Morrison looked back one more time at the empty desert behind them. He couldn't see their pursuers, but he knew they were there. Somewhere in that vast expanse of red rock and sagebrush, Ayana and her warriors were following his trail with the patience of people who had nowhere else to be and nothing but time. The photograph in his saddlebag suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Morrison had wanted to capture the spirit of the Apache people, and he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. The question now was whether that success would cost him his life. Tucson in 1886 was a rough frontier town of adobe buildings and dusty streets, where the line between civilization and wilderness was razor thin. As Morrison and Bradley rode down the main street, their horses lathered with sweat and their clothes caked with desert dust, Morrison felt a surge of relief at the sight of other white faces, store signs in English, and the reassuring presence of a sheriff's office. The town was bustling with the usual frontier activity. Cowboys heading to saloons, merchants loading wagons, women in bonnets shopping for supplies. After 3 days in the desert being pursued by Apache warriors, the mundane sights and sounds of civilization felt like sanctuary. Morrison's first stop was the Grand Hotel, Tucson's finest establishment, where he rented a room on the second floor and immediately drew the curtains. Only when he was safely locked behind a solid wooden door did he allow himself to fully process what had happened. He had escaped the Apache pursuit, at least for now, and was back in the protection of American law and order. But as Morrison unpacked his saddlebags and carefully examined his precious negatives, Bradley's warning echoed in his mind. The guide had insisted that reaching Tucson wouldn't end the matter, that Ayana would continue her pursuit regardless of borders or laws. Morrison tried to dismiss this as frontier superstition, but the memory of the Apache woman's cold eyes and implacable voice made him shiver despite the desert heat. Morrison's plan was simple: develop and print his photographs as quickly as possible, then catch the first stage east to El Paso and the railroad beyond. Once he was back in civilization, far from Apache territory, surely this nightmare would end. The Apache might be fierce fighters in their own desert, but they wouldn't follow him to Boston. The next morning, Morrison set up a makeshift darkroom in the hotel's basement, using chemicals and equipment he had salvaged from his abandoned wagon. Working by the light of a single red lantern, he carefully developed the glass plate negative that contained Ayana's image. When the picture emerged in the developer bath, Morrison caught his breath. Even the crude conditions of his improvised darkroom, he could see that the photograph was extraordinary. Ayana stood like a goddess of war against the dramatic backdrop of the canyon walls, every detail of her war paint and regalia captured in sharp detail. The intensity in her eyes seemed to burn through the glass itself. Morrison had taken thousands of photographs in his career, but nothing had ever approached the raw power of this image. It was art and documentation combined, a perfect capture of a vanishing world and a magnificent people. Whatever the consequences, Morrison knew he had created his masterpiece. He made several prints, working carefully to bring out every detail. The results were stunning. Ayana looked both beautiful and terrifying, a warrior queen from another age. Morrison carefully packed one print in his suitcase and hid the glass negative in a secret compartment he had built into his camera case. This photograph would make his reputation and his fortune. For 3 days, Morrison felt safe in his hotel room. He ventured out only for meals and to book passage on the weekly stage to El Paso. The Apache seemed to have given up their pursuit, and life in Tucson continued its normal rhythm. Morrison began to convince himself that the danger had passed. That illusion was shattered on his 4th day in town. Morrison was eating breakfast in the hotel restaurant when he noticed that conversations at nearby tables had grown quiet. Other diners were glancing toward the large front windows that looked out on Main Street, and Morrison could see concern and confusion on their faces. "What's everyone looking at?" Morrison asked the waitress, a middle-aged Mexican woman named Rosa who had been friendly during his stay. "Indians," Rosa said nervously. "Apache. Been standing out there since sunrise, just watching the hotel." Morrison felt ice form in his stomach. He forced himself to walk calmly to the window and look out at the street. There, standing in the shade of a building across from the hotel, were 6 Apache figures. Even at this distance, Morrison could recognize Ayana's tall form and proud bearing. They made no threatening moves, carried no visible weapons, and disturbed no one. They simply stood and watched as patient as stone. The effect on the town was electric. Conversations stopped when people noticed them, merchants hurried their customers inside, and children were called in from the streets. Morrison retreated to his room, his appetite gone, and his hands shaking. From his second-floor window, he could look down at the Apache watchers. Ayana stood slightly apart from the others, her dark eyes fixed on the hotel entrance. She was no longer wearing war paint, but her presence was no less intimidating in simple Apache clothing. The situation continued for 2 more days. The Apache never approached the hotel, never threatened anyone, never broke any laws. They simply maintained their vigil, taking turns watching the building in shifts that ensured someone was always on duty. The psychological effect was devastating. Town business began to suffer as people grew nervous about venturing onto Main Street. The sheriff, a portly man named Bill Harrison, finally approached the Apache on the 2nd day and had a brief conversation with Ayana. When he returned to his office, his face was grim. Morrison sought out Sheriff Harrison that afternoon, hoping for reassurance or protection. "What do they want?" Morrison asked. "What did the woman say?" Harrison studied Morrison carefully. "You the photographer fellow been staying at the hotel?" "Yes. Edward Morrison, from Boston." Harrison nodded slowly. "Figured as much. That Apache woman says you stole something belongs to her. Says Apache law requires you to give it back or pay blood debt." "It's just a photograph," Morrison protested. "I took her picture with her permission. She posed willingly." "Maybe so," Harrison replied. "But Apaches see things different. She says you trapped her husband's spirit in that picture box of yours, and she aims to get it back. Can't you arrest them for harassment? For threatening a citizen?" Harrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Arrest them for what? Standing on a public street? They ain't threatened nobody, ain't broken no laws. Can't arrest people for being Apache. But surely they can't just stay there forever. Lady says they got all the time in the world. Says Apache are patient people, and she'll wait as long as it takes for you to do the right thing." Morrison felt trapped. The Apache showed no signs of giving up their vigil, and the longer they stayed, the more uncomfortable his situation became. Hotel guests and staff were beginning to look at him with suspicion and resentment. Word was spreading that the Apache presence was somehow his fault. On the 3rd day of the siege, Morrison finally worked up the courage to approach Ayana directly. He waited until late afternoon, when the shadows were long, and most of the townspeople had retreated indoors for dinner. Taking a deep breath, he walked across the street to where Ayana stood beneath a wooden awning. Up close, she was even more impressive than he remembered. Though she was dressed in simple Apache clothing rather than war regalia, there was something regal about her bearing that commanded respect. Her dark eyes fixed on Morrison with an intensity that made him want to look away. "You have something that belongs to me," she said without preamble. Her English was clear and precise, with only a slight accent. "I have a photograph," Morrison replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "One that you agreed to pose for. I agreed to honor my husband's memory. Instead, you trapped his spirit in your magic box. Now he cannot rest with his ancestors. Morrison struggled to find the right words. It's just a picture. It can't hurt anyone's spirit. Ayana's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes grew colder. White men always think they understand Apache beliefs better than Apache. You take our children to schools that kill their spirits. You take our sacred places for your towns and minds. Now you take spirits themselves with picture magic. I meant no disrespect, Morrison insisted. The photograph shows your strength and dignity. It honors your people. Pictures that honor do not steal. Pictures that honor are given freely, not taken by trickery. Morrison felt frustration rising alongside his fear. What do you want from me? I'll pay you. I'll give you money, supplies, anything you need. I want my husband's spirit free to join the ancestors. I want the part of my spirit returned. Apache law is clear. Blood debt must be paid. The finality in her voice made Morrison's blood run cold. And if I refuse? Ayana smiled, and it was one of the most terrifying expressions Morrison had ever seen. Then, Apache warriors will follow you wherever you go. To El Paso, to your railroad, to your city of Boston, if necessary. We are patient people. We can wait. That night, Morrison barely slept. Every sound in the hotel corridor made him jump. Every shadow outside his window might conceal an Apache warrior. The idea that they would follow him all the way to Boston seemed impossible. But something in Ayana's voice had convinced him she meant every word. The next morning brought unexpected complications. Morrison went down to breakfast to find the hotel manager, a nervous man named Peterson, waiting for him in the lobby. Mr. Morrison, Peterson said, his voice apologetic but firm, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to find other accommodations. Morrison felt his stomach drop. What? What? The Apache situation. It's bad for business. Guests are checking out. People won't come into the restaurant. I've got a hotel to run. You can't throw me out because of the Indians, Morrison protested. I'm paying customer. I have rights. And I have a business to protect, Peterson replied. I'm sorry, but you'll need to be out by noon. Morrison looked around the lobby and saw other hotel guests watching the conversation with obvious approval. The message was clear. He had brought trouble to their peaceful town, and they wanted him gone. Within hours, Morrison discovered that no other hotel or boarding house in Tucson would accept him. Word had spread that he was the cause of the Apache presence, and nobody wanted to risk their business by harboring him. The stage line also refused to sell him passage, claiming all seats were reserved indefinitely. Morrison found himself trapped in Tucson with nowhere to stay and no way to leave. The Apache continued their patient vigil, watching and waiting. Ayana's promise that they could wait longer than he could was proving terrifyingly accurate. As evening fell, Morrison sat on a bench outside the closed telegraph office, his suitcases beside him and his precious camera case clutched in his lap. Across the street, Ayana stood in her usual spot, as motionless as a statue. The photograph that was supposed to make his career had instead become his nightmare. For the first time since arriving in Tucson, Morrison began to seriously consider giving up the photograph. The glass negative in his camera case represented months of work and thousands of dollars of investment. But what good was it if he couldn't live to profit from it? As if she could read his thoughts, Ayana began walking across the street toward him. Morrison's heart hammered in his chest, but he forced himself to remain seated. Whatever happened next, running would only make things worse. Ayana stopped a few feet away and studied him in silence for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost gentle. Picture Maker is learning what it means to be hunted. Apache children learn this from birth, how it feels to have nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Now you know Apache truth. Morrison looked up at her, this magnificent woman who had become his nemesis. What do you want me to say? That I'm sorry? That I was wrong? Fine. I'm sorry. I was wrong. But I can't undo what's been done. You can free the trapped spirits. Destroy the picture. Return what you stole. And if I do, what guarantee do I have that this will end? Ayana considered the question carefully. Apache word is sacred. I give you sacred promise. Destroy the picture that traps spirits, and we will return to our people. Blood debt will be paid with return of what was stolen. Morrison stared down at his camera case. Inside was the greatest photograph he had ever taken, the image that could make him rich and famous. But it was also the thing that would get him killed if he tried to keep it. The choice was no longer between success and failure. It was between life and death. And somewhere in the darkness gathering around Tucson, Apache warriors waited for his decision. Morrison spent that night in the livery stable, sleeping fitfully on a bed of hay while his horse munched oats in the next stall. The stable owner, a grizzled man named Jake who had been in Tucson since before the Civil War, had taken pity on Morrison's situation and allowed him to shelter there for a small fee. Seen Apache standoffs before, Jake had said while spreading out a horse blanket for Morrison to use. They got patience like you never seen. Had a cavalry officer holed up here for 2 weeks once, waiting for Apache to give up and go away. They never did. Eventually, he had to face them. What happened to him? Morrison had asked. Jake's expression had been grim. Let's just say the Army sent a new officer to replace him. As dawn broke over Tucson, Morrison found himself no closer to a decision. Part of him insisted that giving up the photograph was surrendering to superstition and primitive thinking. He was a civilized man, a citizen of the United States, protected by law and reason. Apache beliefs about trapped spirits were nothing more than folklore. But another part of Morrison, the part that had spent the last week being hunted across the desert, recognized a hard truth that his Boston upbringing had never taught him. In this place, at this time, Apache law carried more weight than American law. Ayana's beliefs were irrelevant to the situation. What mattered was her determination to act on them. Morrison emerged from the stable to find Tucson already awake and busy. Merchants were opening their shops, women were hanging out washing, children were playing in the dusty streets. But the Apache were still there, maintaining their patient vigil across from where the hotel stood. Morrison counted 6 of them now, 3 men and 3 women, all dressed in simple Apache clothing, but carrying themselves with the unmistakable bearing of warriors. They took shifts watching the hotel and the surrounding streets, ensuring that Morrison's movements were constantly monitored. As Morrison walked toward the general store to buy some food, he noticed how the townspeople reacted to his presence. Conversations stopped when he approached, children were hurried inside, and shop owners watched him with expressions that ranged from suspicion to open hostility. He had become a pariah in Tucson, the man whose foolishness had brought Apache warriors to their peaceful town. At the general store, the owner reluctantly sold Morrison some crackers and jerky, but made his displeasure clear. "How long you planning to stay in our town, mister?" he asked while counting out Morrison's change. "Not long," Morrison replied. "Just waiting for the next stage out." The store owner snorted. "Stage ain't running while them Apache are watching. Driver says he won't risk his passengers or his horses on account of your troubles." Morrison felt the walls closing in around him. With no way to leave town and nowhere to stay, his options were rapidly disappearing. The Apache strategy was working perfectly. They were slowly choking off all his escape routes, forcing him toward the choice they wanted him to make. That afternoon, Morrison decided to attempt a different approach. He sought out Father Miguel Santos, the priest at Tucson's small Catholic church. If anyone might understand the spiritual dimensions of his dilemma, Morrison reasoned, it would be a man of God. Father Santos was a small, elderly Mexican man who had been ministering to Tucson's diverse population for over 20 years. He listened patiently as Morrison explained his situation, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but offering no judgment. "You believe the Apache woman is correct?" Father Santos asked when Morrison finished his story. "That your photograph has somehow trapped spirits?" Morrison struggled with the question. "I don't know what I believe anymore. A week ago, I would have said it was impossible. But I've seen the determination in her eyes, felt the power of her conviction. Whether it's real or not, she believes it absolutely." Father Santos nodded thoughtfully. "In my years here, I have learned that Apache people have deep spiritual beliefs, very different from ours, but no less sincere. Whether or not you accept their theology, you must respect their devotion to it. So you think I should destroy the photograph? I think you should ask yourself what price you are willing to pay for a piece of glass and chemicals. Is any photograph worth your life? Is any image worth the suffering you are causing this woman who believes her husband's spirit is trapped?" That evening, Morrison sat alone behind the stable, staring at his camera case in the fading light. Inside was not just the negative of Ayana, but several other photographs he had taken during his expedition. Months of work, thousands of dollars invested, his dreams of fame and recognition, all reduced to a collection of glass plates and paper prints. But as Morrison sat there, he found his thoughts turning not to his own losses, but to Ayana herself. He remembered the dignity with which she had posed for the photograph, her desire to honor her dead husband's memory. He thought about the grief in her eyes when she spoke of her lost family, the weight of tragedy that she carried with such strength. Morrison had come west to capture the spirit of the Apache people, and he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. But in doing so, he had violated something sacred, taken something that wasn't his to take. The question now was whether he had enough honor left to make it right. As if summoned by his thoughts, Ayanna appeared at the edge of the stable yard. She approached slowly, her hands visible and empty, making no threatening moves. In the gathering twilight, she looked less like a fierce warrior and more like what she truly was, a woman who had lost everything and was trying to hold on to the last connection she had with her dead husband. "Picture maker," she said softly. "Tomorrow the sun will set for the 7th time since we came to this town. Apache patience is great, but not endless." Morrison looked up at her, this magnificent woman who had become the center of his universe for all the wrong reasons. "And after tomorrow? After tomorrow, Apache law requires different action. Blood debt that cannot be paid with return of stolen property must be paid with blood itself." Morrison felt a chill despite the warm evening air. "You would kill me for a photograph?" Ayanna's expression was infinitely sad. "I would kill to free my husband's spirit and return him to his ancestors. Apache law gives no choice in this matter." For the first time, Morrison truly looked at Ayanna as a person rather than as a subject for his camera. He saw the lines of grief around her eyes, the weight of loss in her posture, the desperate love that drove her impossible quest. This wasn't about superstition or primitive beliefs. It was about a woman's love for her dead husband and her determination to honor that love regardless of the cost. "Tell me about him," Morrison said suddenly. "Your husband." Ayanna seemed surprised by the request, but after a moment, she settled down on a wooden crate nearby. "His name was Nailnish, Running Wolf. He was war chief under Geronimo, feared by his enemies, but gentle with children and elders." "How did he die?" "Cavalry found our camp while most warriors were away hunting. Nailnish stayed to help women and children escape. He held the soldiers off long enough for others to reach safety, but took 3 bullets. He lived long enough to see our sons safe, then joined ancestors." Morrison felt shame wash over him. He had seen Nailnish's war regalia as exotic costume, perfect props for his dramatic photograph. He had never considered that they were sacred relics of a man who had died protecting his family. The war clothes in the photograph, everything he wore in his last battle, shirt made by his mother, weapons blessed by Medicine Man, war paint mixed with sacred earth from place where his grandfather was born. "When I wore them for your picture, I thought to honor his memory. Instead, I trapped his spirit in white man's magic." Morrison stared down at his camera case. Inside was more than just a photograph. It was the unwitting prison of a warrior's soul, at least in the mind of the woman who had loved him. Whether Morrison believed in such things was irrelevant. Ayanna believed it with every fiber of her being, and that belief had the power to destroy them both. "If I destroy the photograph," Morrison said carefully, "how do I know this ends? How do I know other Apache won't come for revenge later?" Ayanna met his eyes steadily. "Because I give sacred word. Apache word is bond that cannot be broken. Destroy picture, free trapped spirits, and blood debt is paid. No Apache will pursue you further." Morrison nodded slowly. "And if I don't, then, tomorrow night, when sun has set for 7th time, Apache law requires blood payment. You will die, picture will be destroyed anyway, but spirits will not be freed because debt was not paid willingly." The choice was clear, but that didn't make it easy. Morrison thought about everything he had sacrificed to create this collection of photographs, all the dreams and plans that would die with them. But he also thought about Ayanna's grief, her desperate love for her dead husband, and the absolute certainty in her voice when she spoke of Apache law. Finally, Morrison stood up and walked to his camera case. With shaking hands, he opened the hidden compartment and withdrew the glass negative that contained Ayanna's image. In the fading light, he could see the powerful figure captured in the glass, the warrior woman who had become both his greatest artistic triumph and his potential destroyer. "Here," Morrison said, holding out the negative. "Take it." But Ayanna shook her head. "Must be destroyed by one who traps spirits. Must be willing sacrifice, not for surrender. Only then will spirits be truly free? Morrison looked down at the glass plate in his hands. It would be so easy to drop it, to let it shatter on the ground and in this nightmare. But something made him hesitate. Can I? Morrison's voice cracked slightly. Can I look at it one more time? Ayana nodded silently. Morrison held the negative up to catch the last light of the setting sun. Through the glass, Ayana's image seemed to glow with inner fire. She looked like a goddess of war, magnificent and terrible, beautiful and dangerous. It was, without question, the greatest photograph Morrison had ever taken. It was also the last photograph he would ever take of the Apache people. With deliberate care, Morrison placed the glass negative on the ground between himself and Ayana. Then, raising his boot, he brought it down hard on the precious piece of glass. The negative shattered with a sharp crack that seemed to echo across the stable yard. In the gathering darkness, the fragments of glass caught the last light like fallen stars. Ayana closed her eyes and began speaking in Apache, her voice rising and falling in what sounded like a prayer or chant. When she finished, she opened her eyes and looked directly at Morrison. "It is done," she said simply. "Spirits are free. Blood debt is paid." Morrison stared down at the broken glass that had contained his dreams. And now Apache people return to desert. Picture Maker is free to go wherever spirits call him. Ayana stood and began walking toward the edge of the stable yard. But before she disappeared into the darkness, she turned back one final time. Picture Maker learned Apache truth. Some things too sacred to steal. Maybe next time, he remembered this lesson. And with that, she was gone, disappearing into the night like smoke. Morrison stood alone in the stable yard, surrounded by the scattered fragments of his greatest photograph, wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life or the smartest decision he would ever make. Morrison woke the next morning to an eerie silence that he couldn't quite identify at first. It wasn't until he walked outside the stable and looked across the street that he realized what was different. The Apache were gone. For the first time in a week, the spots where they had maintained their patient vigil stood empty. Word spread quickly through Tucson that the Apache had departed sometime during the night, disappearing as quietly as they had arrived. The townspeople emerged from their cautious isolation like people stepping outside after a long storm, blinking in the morning sunlight, and speaking in the careful tones of those who couldn't quite believe the danger had passed. Morrison felt a complex mixture of relief and loss as he gathered his remaining belongings. The immediate threat to his life was over, but so was his connection to what he was beginning to understand had been the most meaningful encounter of his life. In breaking that glass negative, he had destroyed more than a photograph. He had severed his link to a woman and a culture that had challenged everything he thought he knew about art, honor, and respect. The stage to El Paso was running again, and Morrison bought passage on the first coach departing Tucson. As the adobe buildings of the frontier town fell away behind him, Morrison tried to convince himself that he had made the right choice. He was alive, he was free, and he still had most of his other photographs from the expedition. Perhaps he could build a successful book around them, even without the centerpiece image of Ayana. But as the desert landscape rolled past the stage window, Morrison found his thoughts constantly returning to the Apache woman and their final conversation. Her words about sacred things being too precious to steal echoed in his mind, challenging assumptions about art and ownership that he had never questioned before. The journey back to Boston took 3 weeks, and Morrison used the time to carefully review his remaining photographs and plan his next moves. He had images of Navajo weavers, Pueblo farmers, Hopi dancers, and dozens of landscape shots that captured the grandeur of the American Southwest. While none had the raw power of the destroyed Ayana photograph, they represented solid documentary work that could form the basis of a respectable book. Back in his Beacon Hill studio, Morrison threw himself into the work of printing and organizing his collection. He contacted publishers, arranged exhibitions, and began writing the text that would accompany his photographs. The project moved forward efficiently, but Morrison found that his heart wasn't in it the way it had been before his encounter with Ayana. Something fundamental had changed in Morrison's understanding of his craft. Where once he had seen photography as a means of capturing and preserving beauty for posterity, he now questioned the ethics of pointing his camera at people who might not fully understand what they were giving away. The Apache belief that photographs could trap spirits no longer seemed like primitive superstition. It felt like a metaphor for a deeper truth about consent, respect, and the power dynamics inherent in the act of making pictures. Morrison's book, Faces of the Vanishing West, was published 6 months after his return to Boston. The reviews were respectful, and the photographs were praised for their technical excellence and ethnographic value. But the book never achieved the success Morrison had dreamed of during those long months of preparation in the desert. Something was missing from the collection, and Morrison knew exactly what it was. Without Ayana's photograph as its centerpiece, the book lacked the emotional power and dramatic impact he had envisioned. The other images, while competent, couldn't carry the weight of the story he had wanted to tell. More troubling to Morrison was his growing sense that he had become exactly the kind of photographer he was beginning to despise, someone who treated other people as exotic objects to be captured and displayed for the entertainment of audiences who would never meet them or understand their lives. Looking at his photographs now, Morrison saw not art but evidence of cultural theft, moments stolen from people who had trusted him to treat their images with respect. The success Morrison had sacrificed so much to achieve felt hollow when it finally arrived. His studio remained busy with portrait commissions, his reputation was solid, if unremarkable, and his financial situation was comfortable. But the fire that had driven him to risk his life in the Apache desert had been extinguished along with Ayana's photograph. Morrison began declining assignments that involved photographing Native Americans, claiming a lack of interest in ethnographic work. When pressed by editors and publishers who wanted to capitalize on his Western experience, he would simply say that he had learned some subjects were better left unphotographed. Years passed. Morrison married a proper Boston woman, took over his father-in-law's established photography business, and settled into the comfortable routines of middle-class life. He rarely spoke of his time in the Southwest, and when he did, he never mentioned the Apache woman who had changed his understanding of his art forever. But Morrison never forgot Ayana. In quiet moments, when his studio was empty and the light was just right, he would remember the way she had looked in the desert sunlight, wearing her dead husband's war regalia with such dignity and pride. He would remember the power in her voice when she spoke of spirits and sacred things, the grief in her eyes when she talked about her lost family. Sometimes Morrison wondered what had become of her. Had she returned to her people in the hidden canyon? Had she found peace in knowing that her husband's spirit was free? Had she ever thought of the white photographer who had learned too late the difference between capturing an image and stealing a soul? Morrison never found answers to those questions, but they shaped the rest of his career in ways both subtle and profound. He became known as a photographer who was unusually respectful of his subjects, who took time to explain his process and ensure that people understood what they were agreeing to. He never again took a photograph without explicit permission, and he never again assumed that his artistic vision gave him the right to capture whatever he pleased. The broken glass negative lived on in Morrison's memory as both his greatest artistic achievement and his most important moral lesson. In destroying that photograph, he had lost his chance at fame and recognition, but he had gained something more valuable, an understanding of the weight of responsibility that came with the power to create images. Morrison often wondered if other photographers would understand the choice he had made. In the artistic circles of Boston and New York, his decision would likely be seen as surrender to primitive superstition, a waste of magnificent artistic material. But Morrison had seen the truth in Ayana's eyes, felt the power of her convictions, and learned that some prices were too high to pay for art. As the years passed, and the frontier period of American history became memory rather than living reality, Morrison's photographs gained value as historical documents. Scholars and collectors sought out his work as authentic records of a vanishing way of life. The irony was not lost on Morrison that his pictures of Native Americans were now valued precisely for their ability to preserve what had been lost, the same quality he had once sought to achieve with Ayana's image. But Morrison knew that his lost photograph of the Apache warrior woman would have been different. It wouldn't have been just a historical document or an artistic achievement. It would have been a violation, a theft disguised as preservation. In learning that lesson, Morrison had become a better photographer and, more importantly, a better man. On his 70th birthday, Morrison received an unexpected visitor at his Beacon Hill studio. A young Apache man, dressed in white man's clothes but carrying himself with unmistakable tribal bearing, appeared at Morrison's door with a message that would bring the story full circle. I am Joseph Crow Feather, the young man said, grandson of a chief you met long ago. My grandmother was Ayana. Morrison felt his knees grow weak. After more than 30 years, the Apache had found him again. But this time, the message was different. My grandmother died last winter, Joseph continued. Before she passed, she told me the story of the white picture maker who learned to respect Apache law. She wanted you to know that your choice freed not just her husband's spirit, but her own heart from the weight of hatred she had carried. Morrison invited Joseph into his studio, and over tea, they talked about Ayana and the choice that had defined both their lives. Joseph explained that his grandmother had lived peacefully for many years after their encounter, eventually remarrying and raising a new family while keeping her first husband's memory alive through stories rather than captured images. She said, "You could have been just another white man who took what he wanted and left," Joseph said. "Instead, you showed her that some white men could learn Apache wisdom." She never forgot that lesson. As Joseph prepared to leave, he handed Morrison a small package wrapped in soft buckskin. Inside was a piece of traditional Apache beadwork, intricate geometric patterns worked in blue and white on soft leather. "For my grandmother," Joseph explained. "She made this while thinking of the picture maker who chose honor over fame. She wanted you to have something beautiful that was given freely rather than taken." After Joseph left, Morrison sat in his studio holding Ayana's final gift. In the fading afternoon light, the beadwork seemed to glow with the same inner fire he had seen in her eyes all those years ago in the desert. It was more beautiful than any photograph could have been, because it came with the blessing of its maker rather than the weight of theft. Morrison carefully placed the beadwork in a place of honor in his studio, where it remained for the rest of his life. Visitors often commented on its beauty and asked about its origin, but Morrison would only say that it was a gift from someone who had taught him the true meaning of his art. Years later, when Morrison's estate was settled, the beadwork was donated to a museum along with his photographic collection. The accompanying note, written in Morrison's careful handwriting, reads simply, "A reminder that the most precious images are those we carry in our hearts rather than capture with our cameras." The story of Edward Morrison and Ayana became legend among the Apache people, passed down through generations as a teaching tale about the power of choice and the importance of respecting sacred boundaries. In Apache tradition, it was said that when Morrison broke that glass negative, he freed not just the trapped spirits, but also his own soul from the prison of selfish ambition. And in the end, that freedom proved more valuable than any photograph could have been.